We are looking today at Exodus chapter 3.
Okay.
One of the most famous passages in the Bible. But it's also 10 days away from Christmas when we're recording this. So when it goes out, who knows? But one of the things, this will help demonstrate the fact that you look at passages from your point of view. And right now, our point of view is facing Christmas. So we get to see it.
And what you said, Exodus
chapter 3.
3. Okay. I thought that's what I heard.
Exodus
this is my
chapter 3.
First time hearing about it, talking about it, and knowing what we're diving into today.
And one of these days, we're going to take a look at just one of the passages straight from when you some passage that you looked at, and I'm not going to look at it and said, let's explore it. It'll be kind of fun.
Yeah, that'll be good.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm speaking next week. I haven't been speaking a lot. I'm not teaching till January. I start again, but I haven't been speaking in churches and things like that because I'm not pastoring at the moment, and I'm away from the areas I knew, although that's beginning to change. And so I'm speaking next week to a group in around here in Southern California, and I'm going to talk about a passage, and this is a possibility. The problem with this, and this is important, the problem with me speaking about this passage is I heard from God today about it.
Okay, which is something you like and want more for pastors and churches to set up that way, right?
Right, and the problem is next week I'll have heard
something different.
Dozen things.
Yeah.
And something for Christmas then,
Mm-hmm.
I have somebody, I'm grading a paper right now. In fact, I just started reading it. And for one of my students, I'm long story, but she's writing a paper, which I'm about to read that passage in Exodus chapter 4. So I'm really interested in how that affects me and because I know a lot about the passage, and then I'm reading her research, and it's kind of fun. So heading into that. But in this passage, since it's Christmas, we're going to take a look, because this is, Exodus chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3 is when Moses goes before the burning bush. He sees the burning bush and turns aside. So, one of the most famous passages like ever. Jesus brings it up to the Sadducees to say, because the Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible. So he goes right to the heart when they're saying, they don't believe in the resurrection, all that stuff, and they're questioning him. And he goes right to the heart of where they believe, what they believe. And it's this passage. And he says, that's when he says, God, the Exodus 3 says, God is the God of the father of Abraham and the father of Isaac, or the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. Mm-hmm. And he is not the God of the dead, but the living. He says, you are badly mistaken. At least that's the way it says in Mark. And it's a very fascinating passage. But in other words, he goes straight, not even to a peripheral verse or section that they deal with in only the books that they accept, the Torah, the first 5 books. Mm-hmm. But he goes straight to the heart, to the very central passage that they believe, and he hits it home and just ruins them. It's remarkable what Jesus does, But anyway.
Well, he was a remarkable man and is a remarkable God. So
I would love to go back, because I read some Psalms this week. I'm like, Beth, you got to see this. My wife, Beth, you got to see this passage. Because it talks about the passages of that mention Jesus. One of them's where it talks about him drinking sour wine. The Psalm says it. Mm-hmm. And that's what Jesus does at his crucifixion. He says there's one more thing he had to do.
What Psalm, so that we can...
Psalm...
Do you remember?
I think it's...
We can note it.
Maybe 44, 49. Okay. No, it might be 54, 15. I have to look.
Okay.
But...
we'll have to check it out.
Yeah. Oh, I have to look, because I know I'm on the 4s and 9s. It's a long story. But anyway, we look at this passage, and it's brilliant. I want to know, if you're a pastor or you speak somewhere, I want you to learn to trust the scripture. It's better than you putting all the stuff around it to make it try to be good. You don't need to do it. It's so good. It's so good that you don't want to put the other stuff around it. It's, trust it. It's phenomenal. And we'll see it here.
Yeah.
So, and you sit there, and also I've been exploring this idea of what keeps us from hearing God, what keeps people from hearing God, from just listening to Scripture and hearing God, and it goes to other places too, where you hear God in prayer, you hear God the rest of your week, in other places as well. But what keeps us from hearing God? And I think we get distracted. I mean, you and I have talked about that.
We talked about that the last episode.
Right. And sitting and saying, how do I get quiet and wait and sit there and give God the time so that I can hear and then ask the right questions? Because you were saying, I don't know where to go in this passage, like your last time.
Yeah.
I don't know where to go. How do I, you said get deep. You don't need to get deep. You just need to hear. I had a person on my pastoral staff years ago, and he says, I want to get deep like you do. So he would try to get deep, and it was a mess. It was terrible. I'm like, no, don't get deep. I don't try to get deep. I'm just listening.
So that's one of the things is those that are working on diving in and understanding and hearing. That's the difference, right? Is work on the listening and the hearing God in the Scripture, and not almost would you say forcing deepness, if you will.
Profound. I want something that's meaningful. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about the meaningful. It'll
God will give it to you.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, and let's look. We'll read this passage now. I read today only through verse 8 because I was overwhelmed by then. I was like, oh, that's too much.
Okay. All right.
So I want to save the rest for tomorrow because it's so good, and I'm in no hurry. It says, now Moses was keeping his flock, the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. I don't know why they don't say it in the same thing with the thing that we talked about last time with language. Why don't they say it the way the Hebrew says it? And he came to the mountain of God, Horeb. I mean, what difference does it make?
Yeah,
anyway. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Hineni. Here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. That's the passage. I mean, central, right?
Yeah. And very famous passage, but I couldn't help but notice there's some words not as heavy in here.
Oh, yeah, different.
And they're different. Specifically, in verse 7, I have observed the misery of my people. I think yours says affliction.
Oh, yours says I've observed.
I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt.
Yeah, the ani, it's this word that's, it could go either way. And the idea is that they're the hurting, the affliction, the suffering, that it carries those different ideas. And, but this says, but yours says, I have observed. And mine says, I have surely seen. What it says in Hebrew is let's see, what is it? Verse 7. It says, and the Lord said, seeing, I have seen the misery of my people. That's always, remember that double I talked about?
Yeah.
Holy of Holies, Song of Songs. It's the big one, obviously Song of Songs.
Emphasizing?
Right.
Yeah.
The most holy place or the greatest song, In this case, I have surely seen. You see how he tries to say it in English?
Yeah.
And yours says, I observe. I don't like that one as much.
It's soft.
Yeah, it's a little different.
Yeah.
But, what he says is, I really saw it. I see.
And it's a good picture of God being involved in our lives.
Right. And we're going to come down to that point because let's build our way up to
Okay.
that. So,
I
yeah,
won't
I
jump
know we're
ahead.
just talking about the language now. So, let's move back
Anyways.
because Moses is out doing his duty. He's working.
Mhm.
In fact, he's run away from Egypt. There's so much in those passages. It's just hurts to not talk about them because they're so good. But we get to this passage and he has run away from Egypt. He has this savior complex. He killed this Egyptian in order to save his people. And then he comes to the well when he ran away from Egypt, and he opens the well and jumps in for the daughters of this priest of Midian, whom the priest gives him his daughter, says, "Here, have a wife." It's sort of how it goes. But he has the savior thing, and yet you're going to see some strange stuff about that because now he's out in Nowheresville on the west side, apparently the out there side of the wilderness, tending the flock. And we're going to see this interaction with God.
Well, and we touched on it a little bit last time, but he's outside of distractions.
Yeah.
In the wilderness.
Available
For God to speak to him.
It's a pretty big thing. One of the people I'm really focusing on right now, I don't know, my dean, Dr. Becker, brought it up, was St. Anthony. I think I told you about him the other day. Or
a little bit, yeah.
St. Anthony, he's like the beginning of the Desert Fathers in like 150 or 200 or something like that. I have to look up the dates again. I don't remember. But and he goes out into the wilderness because he's the corruption of society has corrupted him, and he wants to get clean, and he does. He goes out and he wrestles with Satan. He wrestles with God. He goes and has that experience with God and gets away to get close, and then he comes back.
Yeah.
So there's something about that here. I don't know that Moses does it on purpose.
Well, but that was kind of my point, was he's kind of just doing his job, but he's available.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't many distractions around. There isn't society around.
And God does that to us sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He takes you,
captures you when you're away.
Yeah, and it's this. I have a friend who went to church when I was pastoring up in Newark, California. When I was there early, and the guy said, "Yeah, I was at my house fixing he had a vacation home somewhere, and he says, and I fell down, and broke my arm, and God got my attention."
Yeah.
He says, "Hey, I got stuff for you." That was good, but a similar thing like that, where he gets your attention, he stops you,
mm-hmm.
pulls you away, especially pulls you away.
Yeah,
but. So that's
Anyways.
where Moses is, right?
Yep.
And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And it's interesting that it uses the word angel. We don't need to go into that because it's a little, we'll focus on something. And again, this is such an important part. If you're going to talk to people, pick what you're going to talk about. If I picked here, I would probably say, even that passage that we just talked about, that and when the Lord saw that he turned aside. I'll show you why when we get there. I probably would pick that one. Although there's about 10 things we could talk about here. If I'm going to talk about one, I would say, look at that. And we'll tell you why. But there's this angel of the Lord who appears to Moses out of the burning bush, right? And let's see, Moses looked apparently, he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Wonder how long he looked at it. because,
Yeah, 'cause
you know,
if a bush just goes on fire, then when you look at it for a brief moment, you're not going to know whether it's going to be consumed. Now you
right.
assume it will be consumed.
Maybe he,
But-
saw it burning and then he, was tended his flock for another, several hours or, whatever, came back. He's like, it's still burning.
Yeah. Could it have been from afar too?
Yeah.
Potentially?
I mean, probably nobody around.
Yeah.
And he's the only one around. And a lonely time. St. Patrick got saved that way. The
By
famous
himself.
St. Patrick. Yeah, he's out shepherding sheep and, he's a slave up in Ireland. He was English and he got taken as a slave from his family and he's a slave in Ireland and he's out tending flock as a slave and he gets saved out there on his own. Nobody's around. It's a fascinating story, but it's a common story though. It's a common story.
Yeah.
But Moses, he says, and Moses said, I will turn aside. And it's fascinating because he sees that the bush is there, but it says, and Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned.
Curiosity, right?
Right. But now look at what this is. This is the meeting with God. What does Moses know about God? It's a fascinating question. What did the Israelites teach him?
That's true, because again, the Bible's been around for a long time, but it wasn't around
Not with Moses.
With Moses.
Here's the guy who wrote it, for pity's sake. And how much did the Israelites know, and how much did they teach him? How much did his mother teach him as the one who nursed him, even though he was raised in the castle or the
Palace,
whatever. Castle, probably not a castle. But what does he know? And in fact, even here, God says, I am this God. He's about to introduce who he is. So this is the experience that God has with Moses, where he's saying, I'm going to introduce myself to you. This morning at church, we had church, and then afterward we go over and we have kind of a get-together time where different groups get together and we chat. And this morning, at our table, we had 4 of us, my wife and I and 2 other people. And we told our testimonies, how we got saved. And it was fascinating. We had a Cambodian woman there and a guy who's been a pastor for ages, and my wife and I, and we all had different kind of stories. But it's the encounter with God, when God got a hold of us and how he got a hold of us and what he does in that place. And this is what we're experiencing here.
Yeah.
But watch what happens, because Moses says, I'm going to turn aside. Something happened. I bet it happened in your life too, right? When you encountered God. Now, you're a little like me. You grew up in a Christian home and church and things like that. And yet, I told mine. I said, well, at the age of 4, I became a Christian. But I've been looking at it lately, and I think, my real experience, my best and probably much more profound coming to Jesus, if I want to put it that way, experience happened in like my junior year in high school.
I think there is for sure a point in time, even when you're raised in the church and you're raised by a Christian home. And I remember sitting on my red bunk bed in my room, 5 years old, right? I still remember getting baptized too, which I don't know if a lot of people do, but I was old enough to remember that, which was nice.
Right.
But definitely as I got older, when I was 18, it kind of hit me when it's not about the do's and the don'ts.
Right.
It's about the relationship with God.
And something comes along, right? Something grabbed you, some experience, some place, a little like Moses, right?
I was away at church camp, party at Pedro's, up at the lake. Yeah. But it hit me.
Right. And God talks, like he gets a hold of you. He gets your attention. And we see it in a lot of different areas, not just your salvation, but that God still comes along and says, hey, I want you. I know people, for example, to talk about contemporary issues, who really got serious with God because they had a child.
Yep. Changes you, that's for sure.
For sure. After you're done not sleeping for a while.
You go a little crazy and then kind of come back.
And yet, even that stuff, the question is, are you paying attention? Watch what happens. Because Moses says, I will turn aside, right? Well, and it emphasizes that because he says, and he turned aside. It could have just said that, but he doesn't. It says, and Moses said, I will turn aside to see this sight, why the bush is not burned. And here comes the passage. Now, here comes the passage probably I would look at and focus and say, listen to what happens here.
Verse 4.
Yeah. It says, and when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see. What does yours say?
When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look.
Okay, pretty close. And again, it's very similar. It says, and the Lord saw, and he saw the Lord, whatever. Yeah. And the Lord saw that he had turned to see. The and isn't, the one reason I always throw that in there because it's got this vav and it can be translated all kinds of ways. I get it. So either one of those is fine. When, whatever, but sometimes and, but that God saw that he turned aside.
What I see in that is it wasn't God like capturing him. It was him seeking God.
Right.
More so, right?
And God puts this thing out there, this burning bush that isn't consumed.
Hey, if you want, it's here. Come look.
Right.
Yeah.
And he puts that there and say, are you going to come? Here you go. What's going to happen? My wife was telling her testimony, and I brought up this passage this morning. I said, that's like this passage. That's like Moses turning aside, and God says, I saw. And when he saw that Moses had turned aside. See, God gives us these experiences, and he's waiting. Oh, turn aside. Come on, please. I'm giving you this. I want you close to me, and I want to use you. And we'll see all that's going to happen. And Moses turns aside, and God saw that he turned aside. Because obviously God saw that he turned aside. I mean, we would say, well, but they don't waste words. And Moses, who's writing this, by the way, says, and God saw that he turned aside. That's so profound because he's waiting. Even in today, in an experience, this is part of why we get a chance. Look at what we're talking about, reading the Bible, where we say, sit and pray beforehand and put aside distractions and put aside your mental distractions, all that stuff that happens in your head so that you can sit and read and wait. And then comes a passage and you say, what is that? I don't know why you're saying that. What are you talking about? And it may be that kind of experience. Or it can be other experiences in your day where God talks and you see something and he puts something out there. You may not, like Moses, you may not even recognize that as God, but God sees that you responded to something that he put in your way. Because Moses could have said, oh, that's interesting, see ya.
Yeah, gone about a day, you would have missed out on, all of Exodus. The Lord.
Yes.
The work that God calls him to do.
And that's what we think about, like Abraham, right? God called Abraham out of the Chaldeans and out of Haran. And I'm reading it in Acts right now. And he went. We wonder how many people God called before that.
It's I have thought about that before, right? Because God's will be done.
Yeah.
It's just the fact.
Right.
The question is, are you going to answer or is he going to use somebody else?
Are you going to participate in his will and have the benefits of that?
Yeah.
That's what you want. So he saw, and that is what he's waiting for. The God of mercy, the God of love, the great God of the universe is giving us opportunities to respond, and he's looking for them. It's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. And what does he say? and we're going to see this because it says, verse 4, there we are. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. He called him. I mean, that's what God is waiting for, so that he calls you. We haven't even got to the other part. I know, it's so good because I don't, in some ways, I don't want to. I don't want to go to the other part. I want to say, listen, God is calling you. He's giving you a chance. He's gonna, that's who God is. He puts things in front of you.
Yeah.
And ultimately, okay, we're going to go to Christmas since it's Christmas. I mean, let's put this other thing in place where God puts a sign in front of people to respond. Well, what do we got at Christmas? He put a sign in front of the shepherds, the angels, hey, there's this guy. And they're like, I think we'll go see.
Sounds good.
Yes. And they're proclaiming, I get it. He puts this star in front of the wise men, right? I mean, it's on this Christmas, and then a couple years later they managed to get there, but whatever. But still, he puts this sign in front of people. Mm-hmm. And their job and our job is to respond. Yeah. So we have this in the Christmas story. And you wait to see what happens because then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Okay. Take your best shot.
Well, I mean, the first thing I see in that is he's in the presence of the Lord. Where the Lord is holy. So if he's approaching the Lord and he's choosing the Lord to investigate the Lord, mm-hmm. investigate what is being placed in front of him as an opportunity,
and he doesn't know yet, there. Right? He didn't really know it was God, and God called him. Mm-hmm. Right? Good. And God is there. What's he have to do?
He's just to listen.
Take off his shoes.
Well, listen to the Lord who said, take off your shoes.
Right. I mean, you're right. But what is that about? My wife got saved through a long experience. She was engaged. It was 6 weeks before she was supposed to get married to someone other than me.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, just say that.
Yes. And God met her. And really, she got saved, mostly, this is phenomenal, because she, long story short, she knew she needed to obey God. That's a little along the lines of taking your shoes off. You see what I mean?
Well, shoes, especially in his time, were pretty important,
Right.
And could it also be a way of giving or setting aside, giving up something?
Right. I think it's coming with, there's to ask that question. It's a good question to ask, really. What it really does it mean to set aside, to take off your shoes? And in fact, I just, for the same person I'm doing this paper for now, she did a article review on a article that talked about the holiness of God, and it refers to this passage actually. But the question is, what does it mean to be holy, and why does Moses have to take off his shoes? I'm not sure I agree with that article, but Gentry is the guy who wrote it. But it's good though.
I mean, generally, when I think shoes, I think dirty, right?
Yeah.
Is it a type of cleansing yourself before the Lord? Right?
Right.
Could it be some sort of maybe symbolism with future baptism,
or obedience, or recognizing God's holiness, which would work that way? Mm-hmm. I think it's tied in because we're talking about that God is holy, so you just don't come to him any way you want.
Yeah.
There's a passage in the New Testament about Jesus. He tells a parable about the king throwing a wedding party. And it goes several different ways. But at one point, some guy shows up not properly dressed for the wedding. and it's a bad ending. They throw him out into everlasting fire or something like that. And you're saying, wait, what's the deal? You didn't come appropriately. And I know that's such a big deal, because I think we get this buddy idea with God, and we forget the holiness of God. We forget how amazing he is. Look at Isaiah chapter 6. When Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, seated on the throne, and his whatever it is on him filled the temple. And they cried, holy, holy, holy. And his response is, I'm a man of unclean lips, because I've seen the Lord high and lifted up, and among a people of unclean lips. And he gets touched and cleansed. But it's a similar idea. You come into the holiness of God, you come into his presence, and you recognize immediately that you are not holy.
Mm-hmm.
And he is. And the way in is to take your shoes off. It's a humbling thing, I think. But for sure, it's this issue of, I'm not just going to treat him like, anybody. I'm going to come in and recognize who he is and become obedient and surrender and something along that line.
Yeah.
Right? Now,
posturing yourself.
Absolutely. As my wife says, assume the position, kind of like in the airplane movie, assume crash positions, and everybody falls over as if they'd already crashed. But in this case, that's not it. In this case, but look at the Christmas story, because I'm just going to go quick because we've gone through a bunch and I just want to point it out. But God comes to Moses and says, take your sandals off. And then Moses is afraid to look at God because he's afraid to look at the face of God. Good. He understands something, which we ought to understand much better. That we come into, this is a holy, amazing God we're talking about. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen, seeing, I have seen, whatever, the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters or whatever suffering. And I know they're suffering. I like that last part. I know they're suffering. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up to that land of good, a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and where it is. Look at that passage for Christmas. He says, I have seen. I'm giving you a sign. Come see this thing. Here's this child. Unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given.
Mm-hmm.
And because this is the passage, by the way, this is the beginning of the salvation of the Hebrews, the Jews, out of Egypt. That's always when we compare Jesus, we look back, here's the Old Testament best picture. And then we talk about the Red Sea, all that kind of stuff. But here's the best picture of salvation that we have. And it begins right here. And yet, if we talk about Jesus, just to move forward, we say here he says, I have seen the suffering of my people. Well, that's what God is doing with us, right? We suffer. Why? Because we're caught in sin. We're in a sinful world. We're in a corrupt world that corrupts us, and we buy into it and we lose. And therefore, we are under taskmasters, and we need to be delivered. And God has seen them, and he has come to save them from their suffering. Beautiful. See how it's Christmas?
Yeah.
I'm like, man, this is Christmas happening.
Christmas in Exodus.
Right.
It's great.
But remember that part we talked about, especially the part we talked about where it says, God gives you a sign. He's waiting to talk. He puts things in front of you to get you to turn aside. And that turning aside is an important issue, right? And when God saw that he had turned aside, not only that God saw, but that he turned aside. That's what he's waiting for.
Waiting for us to turn to him?
Yeah. To respond to something that he's put in front of us, right?
I think that's a great way to end.
Yes.
God is waiting for us to respond. So what are you going to do with that?